Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Law enforcement of Reddit. What was the most scary paranormal call you have responded to? Story 1. Screams from the shadows.
I am a police officer working on an emergency response team in a busy London borough. We received a call about a suspected domestic incident in a block of flats. The informant stated that she could hear screaming and sounds of a disturbance coming from the flat above her own. Upon arriving, my colleague and I knocked on the door of the flat the informant indicated. I had heard nothing on the way up and could not hear any disturbance coming from the address. In fact, the entire area was eerily silent. After knocking twice with no response, my colleague went downstairs to speak directly to the informant while I stayed by the door. I knocked again, and after some time the door was answered by an elderly woman. She appeared to have been asleep and was understandably alarmed to see me standing outside. I explained that someone had reported hearing a disturbance coming from her flat. I asked if there was anyone else inside with her. She looked confused and assured me that she lived alone and had been sleeping. I requested her permission to come inside to confirm there was no one else present. She invited me in, and I entered the small 2-bedroom flat. The space was in near total darkness, apart from the hall light and a bedside lamp in her room. I began searching each room methodically. As I approached the final door, which led to the living room, my colleague called me on the radio. He told me he was on his way up and asked if I was all right. I responded that everything was fine, but was puzzled by his flustered tone. He explained that he was with the informant and both of them could hear screaming and loud thuds coming from the flat I was inside. I told him he must be mistaken, as I was almost finished searching and had not heard anything unusual. However, I could not shake the growing unease as I reached for the final door. I opened it to find the room in total darkness, but it was freezing cold. My breath misted in the air, and a chill ran down my spine. The room was empty, no signs of disturbance, no open windows, and no explanation for the temperature. I called my colleague and asked him to listen for the sound of my footfalls as I stamped my feet on the floor. He confirmed he could hear them but said that the screaming had stopped the moment I opened the door. After completing the search and finding nothing, I apologized to the elderly woman for disturbing her. My colleague and I left the flat feeling deeply unsettled by the experience. To this day, I have no rational explanation for what occurred.
Story 2. Footsteps upstairs.
Late one evening about a decade ago, I responded silently to a call with additional units in tow. The caller reported hearing footsteps on the second floor of her house while she was in the kitchen. She lived alone, was middle-aged, divorced, had no children, and was not expecting company. When we arrived, she was outside across the street, clearly unnerved, being comforted by her neighbor. Other units arrived shortly after I did and set up a perimeter around the property. We spoke with her, obtained permission to enter, and decided to announce ourselves and clear the house. 3 of us stacked up at the front door, announced our presence, and entered while the other officers monitored the windows from a distance. She had been making a very late dinner, and the aroma of food filled the house. I remember how good it smelled. We cleared the ground floor and made our way to the stairs when we heard it. Unmistakable footsteps on the wooden floor above us. These were not hurried or panicked, like someone trying to escape or hide. Instead, they were calm, deliberate, and almost rhythmic. We announced ourselves again, but there was no response. Instead, the sound of the pacing footsteps began to fade. Quietly, I ascended the steps, adrenaline surging, focusing intently on clearing the corner at the top. I paused a few stairs short, took a deep breath, and continued upward. The hallway at the top was completely dark. After safely clearing the corner, we moved down the hallway, systematically clearing each room. There was nothing, no one, not even an animal. Not that any animal could produce what I can only describe as human footsteps on hardwood. After our initial search, other officers double-checked every possible hiding spot, closets, under beds, appliances, even cupboards. Nothing was out of place, and no one was there. Eventually, we invited the homeowner back inside and reassured her that the house was clear. We attributed the noises to potential wood expansion or shrinkage, trying to ease her mind. None of the officers outside had seen anyone leave, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. I stayed for about 30 minutes after the other units cleared, waiting for her friend to arrive and stay the night. While I waited, I reviewed basic security measures with her and ensured all windows and doors were secured. She even offered me some well-done lasagna, which I appreciated. To this day, I remain convinced that what I encountered that night was not entirely of this world.
Story 3. Candle that would not go out.
About 4 years ago, a lady who I'll call Lucy called our non-emergency line and said she had locked herself out of her house. I responded to take the report in case the fire department needed to force entry. I arrived first and immediately noticed a burning candle and some religious statues in the upstairs window. The light in this room was also on. I can't explain it, but it seemed a bit odd to me. Anyways, I approached Lucy, who appeared to be about 65 years old, and asked what had happened. She said she walked to her car to get groceries for herself and her mother, but forgot her keys inside, and the door had locked behind her. I asked if her mother was home, and Lucy replied in the affirmative. Lucy then went on to say she technically lived alone because her mother had passed away 6 years prior, but she still lives with her in the bedroom with the lit candle and makes her presence known by turning lights on and off, opening and closing doors, and turning on the bathroom faucet. I then walked around the perimeter of the home and found an unlocked window into the kitchen. Since Lucy had never actually left home and knew no one else was inside, I radioed dispatch and climbed in through the window with her consent. As my boot touched the kitchen floor, I heard an audible click. At the same time, the lights in the stairway and upstairs hallway to my left turned off. I quickly walked to the rear sliding door to my right and advised Lucy what had happened. Lucy laughed and said that was just her mother saying hello. I told Lucy that although I genuinely believed what she told me was true, I still had to do my due diligence and ensure no one else was inside. I radioed for backup, and within minutes my colleague arrived. The first thing he asked about was the lit candle in the window. While clearing the upstairs, we came upon the room where the candle was, and immediately noticed that it was blown out. There were no open windows, fans, vents, or any other obvious source that could have extinguished the flame. We just looked at each other with a bit of unease, and went back downstairs to leave. As we did, the upstairs lights turned off behind us. We talked to Lucy for another 5 minutes, and suggested getting a battery-operated candle just to be safe. Well, Lucy clearly wasn't concerned because to this day that candle burns in the open window most nights when I drive by. And every now and then, I'll stop and talk to Lucy to see how she and her mother are doing.
Story 4. Forgotten family curse.
It started as a routine job. I was hired to clean out the old family estate on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years, left to decay after the last of the family passed away under mysterious circumstances. The family was known for their wealth, their opulent taste, and their reclusive nature. But after the tragic events, no one dared approach the estate. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses, at least. That's what I told myself. I was just here to clean. But something about this house, it felt wrong. The air inside was heavy, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The grand chandelier in the entryway had long since lost its shine, covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were lined with faded portraits, eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. But it was the basement that caught my attention. The house had one of those old, creaky doors leading down to the cellar. It had been locked, but the key was conveniently left on a dusty shelf in the kitchen. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. What I found down there wasn't what I expected. The basement was pristine, as if it had never been touched by time. There were no broken pipes, no remnants of the past that had left the upper floors in disrepair. Instead, the room was filled with boxes full of perfectly preserved unused objects. China sets, furniture, paintings, and hundreds of leather-bound books, all untouched by dust. But the strangest thing was a small wooden box sitting in the center of the room. It was intricately carved, the surface gleaming despite the lack of light. I couldn't help myself. I approached it, my fingers brushing the top. As soon as I made contact, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room. I opened the box, expecting to find something trivial like an old watch or a trinket. Instead, there was a small, perfectly preserved note written in elegant, flowing handwriting. "You have freed us." Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I slammed the box shut and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the top, I heard a faint, whispering voice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a soft murmur that grew louder with each passing second. "Thank you for releasing us." I rushed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. But when I looked back, I saw the shadows of figures standing in the windows, figures I knew weren't there before. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My dreams were plagued by dark figures, whispers, and visions of the basement. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house had never been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone to come back, to open that box and release what had been locked away. And now that I had, they were free to follow me.
Story 5. The Whispering Door.
In 2014, I worked security for several years after high school. One night, my partner and I were patrolling an old, abandoned building that had a notorious reputation for being haunted. It was the oldest building in the area, and there were countless rumors about ghostly activity, especially in the basement. My partner had already been inside earlier and found a door that led to the basement. Neither of us spoke much about it, but I could feel an eerie tension hanging in the air. As we walked through the hallways, everything seemed oddly quiet, but there was something unsettling about the silence. Then, over my earpiece, I heard a strange whisper. It was a soft, drawn-out hiss of a word, "door." It sounded like someone had breathed it directly into the speaker. I froze for a second and asked my partner if he had said anything. He sounded confused, replying that he hadn't spoken. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't want to alarm him, so I said nothing about what I had heard. Later, after we finished our rounds and left the building, my partner admitted that something was off in that basement. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him. His discomfort seemed to confirm what I had heard, but I didn't press further. The thought of it still unsettles me to this day. Another time, we were tasked with transporting a psychiatric patient from the emergency room to a mental health facility. This man was completely disoriented, heavily medicated, and in a zombie-like state. As I sat beside him in the vehicle, he suddenly turned toward me, his gaze becoming lucid. He looked me straight in the eyes and calmly said, "Well, you look like you're ready to bury another dog." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Just that morning, I had buried my dog who had passed away in her sleep. I couldn't even reply as he returned to his disoriented state, mumbling and rocking back and forth. The sudden clarity in his voice haunted me. The most unnerving experience came when I had to patrol an old outdoor theater late at night. Unbeknownst to me at the time, a body had been found on the grounds and it was thought to be a victim of Ted Bundy. As I walked through the pitch-black darkness, my flashlight's beam seemed weak, like the darkness itself was absorbing the light. I stopped for a smoke break, and when I turned my flashlight back on, my heart stopped. My shadow was cast in front of me as though a light was behind me, but there was nothing. I turned around expecting to find someone, but the night remained still. The feeling of being watched stayed with me as I quickly finished my shift. I never went back there alone after that night.
Story 6. Shadow in the Trees.
It was a quiet night when we received the call. A woman had reported hearing strange noises coming from the woods behind her house. At first it seemed like a routine call, another person spooked by the sounds of the forest at night. But as soon as we arrived, I could feel something was off. The house was isolated, surrounded by trees and overgrown brush. The woman, visibly shaken, told us she had heard someone calling her name in the woods, but no one had been there when she looked outside. Her eyes were wide with fear as she described the whispers, soft, almost pleading, echoing from the trees. She insisted it wasn't the wind or an animal. We walked into the woods to investigate. The air felt heavy, the kind of stillness that presses on your chest. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and thick foliage. We heard nothing at first, only the sound of our footsteps crunching on the leaves. But then, a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it grew louder, clearer, until it was almost as if someone was standing right behind us. It was my name. It called out over and over, but no one was there. I turned to my partner, but he wasn't looking at me. He was staring ahead, his face pale. Following his gaze, I saw a figure standing just out of the reach of our flashlight beams. A tall silhouette, its features impossible to make out. My heart stopped as the figure slowly began to move toward us. We ran back to the house, but when we turned around, the figure was gone. The woman never heard the voice again, but neither of us could shake the feeling that something had been watching us. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night, but I know I've never felt that kind of fear before.
Story 7. Vanishing Presence.
It was my second year working in a small town, and the calls we got were usually routine: break-ins, traffic stops, the occasional domestic dispute. But this one was different. We received a call from a man who sounded terrified, his voice trembling as he explained that something was in his house, something he couldn't see but could feel. At first, I thought it was a prank, but his desperation was palpable. I could hear something moving in the background, dragging across the floor. "Please, it's in here with me," he whispered. "I can feel it watching." When we arrived, the house was eerily silent. The man, a middle-aged mechanic, sat in the corner of his living room, trembling, his face pale and covered in sweat. There were no signs of forced entry, and the house seemed undisturbed. But something was wrong. He pointed to the hallway leading to the kitchen. "It's been following me all night. I can't see it, but it's there." We cautiously made our way down the hallway, our flashlights scanning the shadows. There was no sign of an intruder, but the air felt colder than it should have been. I brushed it off as nerves, until I heard it. A soft whisper came from the kitchen, too faint to make out. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances before stepping into the room. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. That's when we saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner, its shape barely perceptible in the dim light. I reached for my radio, but the static was deafening. The figure in the corner didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like an oppressive weight pressing on my chest. Suddenly, the figure vanished. The room went dead silent. The lights flickered back on, and the temperature returned to normal. The man was still in the living room, staring at us with wide eyes, but he hadn't moved an inch. He looked at us as if to say, "Did you see that?" But we never answered. The investigation was inconclusive, and no one could explain what happened that night. But the man never returned to the house. He disappeared without a trace. I still don't know what we encountered that night, but every time I drive by that house, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up.
Story 8. Face in the Box.
It was just another typical night shift, and I was called out to a remote cabin in the woods. The call came through as a strange noise disturbance, just some odd sounds reported by a neighboring cabin. No big deal, I thought. When I arrived at the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the odd silence. There were no lights on, and the place looked almost abandoned. The wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I pushed it open with caution and entered the dimly lit living room. The air was musty, the scent of decay lingering like something had been left untouched for years. I called out into the darkness, "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. I checked the rest of the cabin, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the small attic. Everything seemed in place. Nothing was out of the ordinary, except for the unnerving silence. It was like the house itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed something odd. The floorboards in the corner of the hallway were slightly raised. Curious, I bent down and noticed a small hatch hidden beneath the floor. My instincts screamed to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I lifted the hatch, revealing a narrow staircase that led deep into the earth. The musty smell became stronger. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing the light. The air grew colder as I reached the bottom, and I could feel something watching me. My heart pounded in my chest. At the bottom of the stairs I found a small room, dimly lit by an old oil lamp. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a large wooden box, the lid slightly open. I felt an overwhelming urge to look inside, but a voice in my head told me to run. Against my better judgment, I peered inside. What I saw froze me in place. A face, pale, twisted, and barely human. It was staring right back at me, its eyes wide with terror. The moment our eyes locked, the face began to move, its mouth opening in a silent scream. I ran out of that cabin faster than I've ever run in my life, never looking back. To this day, I can still hear that silent scream in my nightmares.
Story 9. The Cursed House.
It was late, and I was assigned a routine call to investigate a supposed break-in at an old house on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years, but there were rumors about its dark past. People said strange things had happened there. Lights flickered on and off, mysterious noises echoed from within, and some claimed they saw figures in the windows at night. As a law enforcement officer, I didn't put stock in those kinds of tales, but something about this call felt different. When I arrived, the house seemed strangely alive, despite its decayed state. The windows were cracked, the paint peeling from the walls, but there was a dim light flickering inside. I drew my weapon and carefully approached the front door. It was ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking, and stepped into the dark interior. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, with a cold that I couldn't explain. The house had a strange energy, like the very walls were pulsing with something unnatural. I called out into the darkness, "Police, is anyone here?" No answer. I moved further into the house, flashlight in hand, sweeping the rooms as I went. Everything seemed in disarray: broken furniture, overturned lamps, and strange symbols etched into the walls, some of which seemed to glow faintly in the dark. As I continued deeper into the house, I noticed a faint chanting sound echoing from somewhere below. I descended into the basement, my heartbeat quickening with each step. The chanting grew louder, more distorted. The air felt charged, thick with an oppressive presence. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a room lit by candles, each one placed around a large, intricately drawn circle on the floor. Inside the circle stood a man, his back to me, hands raised as if conducting some ritual. The symbols on the walls seemed to move and twist in the candlelight. Before I could say anything, the man turned, his face pale and twisted with unnatural markings, eyes glowing with a sickly yellow hue. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his voice low and filled with malice. In that instant, I felt a pull, an invisible force dragging me toward him. My body refused to move, and my vision blurred. The air thickened with dark magic, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. The man smiled wickedly, his teeth sharp and jagged like a predator's. With every ounce of strength, I fought against the force, broke free, and ran back up the stairs, not daring to look behind me. I never reported what happened that night. The moment I stepped out of that house, I could feel the weight of the darkness lifting from me, but the chill never left my bones, and I'll never forget the man's words, "You shouldn't have come." A Truba Danton.
Story 10. Abandoned Naval Hospital.
I worked at the Naval Hospital in Camp Pendleton in 2013. I was part of the transition team that moved the last of the belongings that they wanted from their old location to their new one. Along with others on my team, we were part of the final sweep as far as cleaning up, waxing the floors, and locking up some of the higher level rooms within the old hospital. It was a nice gig because there was a ton of office supplies that were going to just get thrown away, along with some office chairs. I like to draw, so I took home 2 chairs, one for me and one for my roommate, along with a plethora of pens and paper. In my duty section, there was also the security role of watching over the barracks that were just outside of the hospital. With the Navy, being the Navy, they didn't transfer anyone over to the new barracks until about a full 8 months after the move to the new hospital. So someone still had to stand duty there, as well as patrol the old hospital to keep away any would-be vandals from a place they thought was completely abandoned. Of course, I would end up getting duty one day and would start getting people coming into the commons area telling me to go look at the hospital. There was very clearly a light on in the 6th or 7th floor with a figure standing motionless, watching outside. I put up a sign saying that I would be leaving the office and to call my personal number should they need anything. Usually it was just to reset their key cards, but each room had 4 rooms within it, so usually people just called their roommates to open the doors instead of waiting for the process of me resetting their key card. It was already pretty late at night, so I wasn't worried about it. I went to the hospital and it was still completely locked all around. I checked to make sure that no windows were ajar, but the hospital didn't have any that opened. I even tried to lift the back hatch that linens and new supplies came through by truck, and that was still secured. I had no other way of getting in myself, so when my chief came down around 2 a.m., as they seldomly did, but were required to at least once a night, I made a report of it. By this time the figure was gone, but the light remained on. I was never told if they ever found anyone, or if it was even followed up on for that matter. But it was one of the creepiest things I remember from being there.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below, and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight, and remember, not all shadows are empty.